Okay, cool. So I did my project on the Chinese tunnels under Boise. Uh, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of them, but uh, I'll play you sort of my intro that will give you like an idea of what they're all about. And but the two sides of it basically are that the myth of these tunnels is either, or the idea, the legend is either a racist myth that comes from the idea of like, oh, the Chinese are scuttling around underground like vermin, or that we really oppressed the Chinese. At one point, 1 in 3 people in Idaho were Chinese. And that we oppressed them to the point where they went underground. And that was how it was all over the US. Is there's these tunnel rumors like everywhere. They have tours of them in some cities, but so that's kind of the thing. And I apologize, the audio is like a little fast. I worked so hard on this and it was like awesome. And when I was putting the finishing touches on it, my thing crashed and the audio file was compromised. So even though I had backups, the original audio thing didn't work. So I had to like use what I could. And the whole time I was like, I know something's going to go wrong here at the end. But anyway, so let me know if you can't hear this.
I don't know how people could deny that they weren't there. They were a reality. And now they're in the myth, I guess. There was never any doubting that they existed.
The thing that people don't realize is that the basis of these tunnel stories come out of racist, anti-Chinese.
People say, oh, this is just an urban myth.
I don't know.
That's a bunch of crap. They've never been down there.
It was as if they didn't want any trace of there being a Chinese presence in Boise whatsoever, which I would call purely white supremacy. It was white supremacy.
My name is Molly Seiniger, and this is Unearthed. The legend of the Chinese tunnels under Boise has been a mystery for more than a century. There's a hidden labyrinth of tunnels under the city, and a number of locations are rumored to still have access to the tunnels. Believers say the Chinese immigrants built these tunnels to escape the world above and move around the city without detection. Gambling, opium, and other nefarious activities supposedly took place in these tunnels. Non-believers say the tunnels are just a myth generated by residents suspicious of the Chinese. The argument over these tunnels' existence is so filled with vitriol, people get banned from Facebook pages. People have even come close to blows over the subject. But for some, the question still remains. Are there 150-year-old tunnels under Boise?
But I don't know. So that's kind of like the intro that I had, and I feel like it explains sort of the legend a little bit. And so the song actually ties in. I didn't want to like do the whole pay royalties or whatever. And so my cousin's a musician in Maryland or something, and so he has a song called IDK. And I asked if I could use it, and I asked him like what the song meant to him, and he said it's a confident approach to uncertainty, which was like so applicable here because it's about not knowing, like, is this a thing or is this not a thing? Because you have historians be like, no, the tunnels are a myth, but then you have people who are like, nope, they're not. I've been in them. We own a business where these tunnels are. My grandfather was the chief of police and went in the tunnels, so it's like, what is going on here? Why is there miscommunication? So my project was looking at the controversy of the tunnels like through this critical lens, and by analyzing the discursive context of the tunnels to understand why there's this miscommunication. And like I said before, I have collected every single post ever of all of these, like every single Idaho and Boise history Facebook page I could find. Every post that has anything to do with the Chinese, something underground, the Chinese tunnels, and all of the dialogue there. So every single conversation, you can do the little like read more or, thing, like expanded all of those. So I have like hundreds of pages of discourse. So like, that's how I was able to really get a grasp on like the conversation now as it is. And so the reason that I liked the critical lens, I'll talk about a little more, but it's something that gave me the opportunity to look at this uncertainty and be like, okay, I know if I look at it through this lens, I'll be able to figure out what's going on here. Not be like, it's at this place, in this place, but be like, what's the deal? So basically, the purpose of this project was to decipher the mystery and the controversy by using the critical lens. And I think it's relevant for a couple of reasons in terms of like the communication field side of it. I think it's relevant because, and sort of my thesis-ish was like, how can communication lead to an unintentional injustice? And how can ignoring stereotypes like whitewash history? Because I should say that I think their intentions are good when they say either the tunnels exist or the tunnels don't exist. Because they're like, that's a racist rumor that you shouldn't like, what's the word? Perpetuate. So that was sort of the idea of like the communication field is like, how can this actually happen? And then, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that as I looked into this, it's sort of really paralleled like Black Lives Matter right now, because it's what I noticed after looking into this and researching like the history, and I interviewed tons of people, is we've gone from like oppression of the Chinese, like driving them underground, to suppressing their history and making light of it. And we don't see it from the right perspective. And there's a systemic racism that was going on. And so now it's kind of like, hey, like this is happening. You know what I mean? So I think there's other parallels there too, but I thought it was, it's sort of relevant for that. And it's important because like with communication, recognizing that this is a thing. And then also to me, this is really important because for several reasons, but like one of them is that like time is running out. Like this was something that was in like, late 1800s to early 1900s. And so it's like people's parents, and these people are like, I don't know how to say it politely, but like dropping like flies. So Arthur Hart, like the main historian of Idaho, and the only historian who has looked in that I could possibly find, legitimate historian that's looked into these tunnels, died 2 days ago. So it's like, oh God, like I had to talk to everybody. And let me like put a pin in that and actually explain to you the reason that I think these tunnels are real, that I believe it, is Edmund Fong. His father was Harry Fong, who was the unofficial, because it's obviously not like a municipality, unofficial mayor of Chinatown. Edmund Fong, who I got to speak to personally, told me these tunnels are real, and my dad told me about them. His dad was the head of the, Hip Sing Tong Association, which is like the big Chinese association in Boise. So what I'm operating off of, aside from every single location that the tunnels are rumored to have, like line up perfectly with a Chinese place being there at one point. Aside from that, just so you know, that's kind of where I'm coming from because I respect his perspective. But so anyway, that's just, I feel like I should mention that. So, and the other reason it's important to me is that I just, the more I look into it, I feel like there's such an injustice that's happened. And the message of these tunnels has become warped and whitewashed because what we've done essentially by believing that this is impossible, because what I found is everyone thinks Boise's in this bubble where we're like, okay, I realize all these atrocities were going on right outside of Boise, but Boise wasn't really like that though. Like, we weren't that bad. Like, everyone thinks that. And like, all of these pages, like, I'm continuously shocked how little people know about this. And I didn't know about it either. Like, I didn't know we had a Chinatown till I was 18. And so we're unburdening ourselves. We're by like changing and whitewashing this message, instead of being like, holy crap, we oppress these people like to the point of being driven underground in order to live their lives. And now it's like, well, it's just kind of racist that you think that stereotype happened, because those weren't real. And so it's a racist stereotype. So it's like totally trivializing their struggles. And I'm like, this is wrong. It's because their memory is not going to be like, holy crap, we oppress these people. Now it's just like, oh yeah, there was some myth about Chinese like running underground, running drugs. And it's like, that's wrong. And so anyway, that part I get real steamed about. But so advocacy is why it's so meaningful to me. So the summary of like the project is sort of, there's several parts to it. In order, like I was saying, like the critical lens is sort of the overarching lens that we look at things. So I don't know what majors you guys are in, but the critical tradition sort of stems from Marxism. And so it's the idea that there are like, their ideology is sort of like implicitly like part of power structures, and power structures are like embedded in our lives. And so, for example, like someone who's left-handed, writing, they always get like the smudge or whatever right here when they write stuff, because of the way that we write normally. And things like a computer mouse or a pair of scissors, it's not necessarily like, oh yeah, let's oppress these left-handed people, but it's just kind of like, those are things that occur. And so in order to uncover those, you have to like question, and you have to challenge, and, what are we taking for granted? What aren't we thinking about? And so that's like really what I wanted to portray. So in that first part, I sort of cover what these tools are in that part, because if we're going to approach an uncertainty, like, and know we're doing it right, we have to use this critical lens. And the other communication theories I touch on are like standpoint theory and epistemology. And epistemology is basically like the theory of knowledge. So for example, I talked to one guy who was like, oh, well, these aren't real because this historian who studied these things in Idaho City didn't find any there, so that means they're not here. And I'm like, okay, cool, appreciate that. And I didn't say this to him, obviously, but I was like, but Edmund Fong, whose dad was the mayor of Chinatown, his dad is literally in the history books, like there's this picture there, said that it was. So, and so the idea comes from like, people in the privileged class don't have, and the dominant class don't have access to information and knowledge that people of, the minority has. They don't see what's actually there. And that really comes into play. And so the other things are, narrative, really just narrative in general, but narrative rationality, and sort of like how is the story being told and what rings true to us? And the social construction is a huge part of it, because it's like we socially construct what the story is. So social construction is the idea that like, society and reality isn't just like, there and that we just act because that's how it is. It's like we construct our reality. And at some point that social construction becomes the truth. And that's why I think it's so important that these tunnels, like the truth of them comes out, because at some point the truth will be forgotten. And the oppression will be forgotten, and that's wrong to me. So, and that's part of the ideology, and then like also sort of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is basically like language. So, what does a tunnel, like when I say tunnel, do you think of like a gopher hole, or do you think knocked through walls and basements? Because those are proven, like people will acknowledge, like, yeah, that happened. So if someone's definition of a tunnel is different than the person writing history, how they phrase that dictates history, because our understanding of what a tunnel is could be different. So one thing that I played, and I kind of want to play it here because I think it's like just a really great example of getting this point across with the tools. And I think and I couldn't think of anything other than tools. I know it's kind of cliche, but I didn't have a better phrase for it. But it's a really great example of like how we should look at this. And so like Key and Peele, I don't know if you guys know who they are. They're like comedians. So this is like one of their clips, and there's like some bleeped out words and stuff, but we're all adults. So
you ever have a white dude come up to you talking about, hey man, dude, I know, King Kong, that's racist. Have you had this? I've had that. Dude, I was like, what? Is it racist? I don't even think. He's like, think about it, man. Bunch of white dudes that go to an island, all this Aborigine. I'm like, okay. All right, I'm with you so far. You know, get a big black gorilla comes and starts around with white girls in New York. Whoa, what the That's your man. What? You're racist, bitch.
So, like, hopefully that kind of explained, like, how is this story being told? Like, because the story of King Kong is there, but the person framing it, the narrative, is different depending on who's telling the story. And that's just such a critical part of this. And so I put that meme up there also. I forgot to mention, obviously I take COVID very seriously, but I think it's kind of funny because part of this whole narrative thing is the unmasking. I'm like, what's really behind this? Like, what's the idea that's actually happening? And then also, oops, sorry. I talk about history in it, and it's not just the history of the tunnels, because what I found through researching this is that it was so much more than the history of the tunnels. The history of the tunnels is like, you know, an after effect of how much we understand the actual history. And so I feel like I had to go over, like, what was it actually like? Because if people don't understand the degree of oppression and brutality, then they don't understand why there could be tunnels, because everyone's like, but why? So, you know, for example, and it's an ongoing thing. I suppose this is something I forgot to mention. This is not like something, because we're continuing to change the story to fit our narrative and the narrative we want to believe, that we're not, you know, wasn't that big a deal. I lost my train of thought there, sorry. Anyway, I get so steamed about these whole tunnels. Oh yeah, okay, so it's a continued suppression of history. Like, have you guys ever heard of the Hell's Canyon Massacre? So that was in 1887, and in my podcast, I'm even like, hey, like, here's, you know, graphic content up ahead. So I'll like keep the brutalist parts out of it. But it's basically when in Idaho, at least 34, it's likely that there were more, Chinese miners were completely slaughtered and then mutilated by a gang of 7, I think, white, like, bandits. And that was, I mean, it's just horribly graphic. And then we know this happened, and we know the story of it because one of the kids who was involved, he was like 16, and he was dying of, like, I want to say diphtheria, but I can't, I don't know for sure, something like that happens back in the day. And so he told his dad, like, okay, so I did this with my buds. So we have like a firsthand account of what happened. no one was ever charged with, like, they were charged. No one got in trouble for it. They were like, man, it's just, what can you do? Because no one ever convicted a white person against a Chinese. It's like unheard of. I'm getting off on that part, but the point is that I want to make is that, guess when this massacre was acknowledged by the local government? Like, can you guys guess at all? In 2005. They didn't acknowledge it until 2005. Like, that's, you know, and that was because there was some documented evidence, but there isn't of these tunnels. And so we can't assume like, oh, you know, we've moved on, life is better, like we've accepted what we've done wrong. Like, no. And that's so important to me. Because, and I suppose I should say my little sister is Chinese. And so when the Kung flu thing happened, she's gotten like, she's regularly, you know, accosted on the street with like racial slurs, but now it's even more so. And it's, to me, it's like 1 in 3 people used to look like her here, you know, and it's something that we don't, it's a social construction that we accept. We frown upon racism, but what can you do? You know what I mean? And it's kind of like what we could do. The only idea I have, I don't have a lot of ideas normally, is like maybe acknowledge like the brutality, because that can change the story, you know? And I get off on all these things, but so that's sort of what that project is about. And in it, I also like, you know, I interview the witnesses and the tunnel deniers, and because I want to have a holistic understanding of the tunnels. I didn't want to be like, go into it and be like, this is the reality of the tunnels, you know, until I spoke to Edmund Fong, I was like, I don't know what's going on. And so that's sort of the summary of the project, and just sort of like, what's the dealio here? And so my takeaways were, or I guess to wrap it up, that there's just a astounding misunderstanding of history. And people think that Boise is in this bubble, this like impenetrable moral bubble where everywhere else around us, I mean, people would lynch Chinese, not a big deal at all. And like, you know, a couple miles from us, but somehow Boise was completely immune to that. People like reading these comments and speaking to some of these people, you're like, how are you, where are you? You know, that is not true. And so we think that we're in this moral bubble, you know, and so when we whitewash this memory and our role in things, it is a privilege for us. And, you know, I put Sundown City on the slides there because another thing a lot of people don't know is the Sundown City, up until like sort of the 70s, we were a sundown city, which meant that you could not be a person of color out after 6 p.m. on the street. Absolutely not. You were arrested on the spot. I talked to a police officer who's like, I've looked at the dockets and the offense will say Chinaman. And that meant out on the street after 6 p.m. Like, and when I told one of the people I interviewed, like, I asked him, I was like, so, you know, what do you think about this idea that maybe the reason they had tunnels were because they couldn't be out on the street? And what he said was like, well, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go anyway? And I don't know, after being quarantined and having like, you know, Uber Eats and Netflix and everything, I'm like, I still want to leave the house. So just the cognitive dissonance was a huge part of, you know, the Boise bubble. You know, how do we justify these things? And so my main takeaway is that we've taken like the coward's way out, and it's been a cop-out. You know, we have changed the story from oppressing these people to the point they go underground to live their lives. there was something called queue cutting, which, you know, in Chinese, they have that really long tail of hair. That's a queue. And if your queue was cut, you could not go back to China. If you were in China, it was an act of treason and you were beheaded. All of these people came here to gold mine and go back to their families in China. And so people would do that. They'd grab it and they'd cut their queue off. Like, I don't know how else to say it other than like, they were totally screwed. Like, you couldn't go back to China now. You've worked this whole time here. You've endured all of this brutality. And now you can't even go. Like, that was a thing that happened on the street. It was like funny. It was a joke. The papers always had like comics about it. And so we went from like forcing these people underground and like oppression and queue cutting to changing the story of like, well, it's just kind of racist that you think that the Chinese were scuttling underground like rats. And it's like, that is not like, it's kind of like, what a way to trivialize the plight of these people. And so it's like when we blindly accept this narrative and we don't use a critical lens to be like, hold on, let's look, you know, that's why I say ignoring stereotypes is not like, oh, they were like this, but just kind of like, okay, like, let's look at the ideology in this stereotype. What did that mean at the time? You know, what does that mean now? Just questioning everything. But I'm a Sagittarius and we're known to do that. So basically, you know, being able to change that story is privilege itself. And I think that is something that we have the ability to advocate for. And, you know, they've long passed and their memory's fading. And it's our chance to make sure it's not forgotten and to accept what we did. And, you know, my parents weren't here in the 70s. Or didn't get here till the 70s. So I didn't do it, but I was like, this is Boise. This is my home. Like, I take pride in this place. And so even though it wasn't me that did it, I'm a part of oppressing this, you know, of suppressing an oppression. And it's my job to do something about it. I don't know. So that's pretty much all I've got. If you guys have any questions about anything?
We'll open it up to the students first and then ask a couple of questions.
I'll go. In some of the people you interviewed, that denied that the tunnels were real, what was like the main reason they didn't believe? There was like a common theme of why they didn't believe they actually happened, or?
Yeah, so there were a couple common themes. Like, one was like, they're like, why? They like have no reason to. And it's kind of like, that's why I go over that history. It's like, well, I did sort of have a reason. And another guy who was like, well, actually, all of these tunnels were convection rooms. And so they were just used for the heating thing. And I'm like, that's true. However, there was one architect, toured a lot in Boise, and so like, if you go to Dharma Sushi, that actually had a tunnel under it. Egyptian Theater had a tunnel under it. Goldie's Breakfast Bistro, that was sort of Chinatown there. They built these buildings, and the way that they built them, I think all of it corresponds to the exact locations of the tunnel. Is they utilized those tunnels as like a convection whatever. And then also Prohibition was right after that. So I don't know if that was involved, but I spoke to a guy who's a historian, but he used to also be a construction worker. And he said that when you build a new building, you don't like scoop out the bottom foundations of the old one and start from scratch. You build off of it. And so that was the other argument. And then people would be like, well, it's impossible to build these things under roads. However, right where the main tunnel is a canal or a creek under the city, and it lines up perfectly. This guy I'm talking about was like, what are they going to tunnel under the canal? And I'm like, no, the canal was the tunnel. So, you know, I don't know if that answered your question.
And what kind of businesses did you say that they were running underground mostly, or was it just like a?
So a couple of the reasons was white brutality, and the things that did happen were opium smuggling, which I didn't think was a huge part of it actually. And like, in fairness, in critical lens, I did have part of this. My approach was to be like, hey, like, let's give the Chinese, like, let's do them justice here. But there was more opium smuggling than I thought. And how I learned that was in 2017, they discovered a video in the Idaho State Archives in a vault. And it was just labeled Chinese, like Chinese tunnels. And there was no audio to it. It was an 18-minute video. And Edmund Fong's brother, Raymond Fong, was in that video. But so were able to recover 6 minutes of audio. But it didn't say like a ton. But a guy that I went out with really liked me in the story of the tunnel. So he sent it to a lip reader, and the lip reader said like there was way more opium involved, and they were really tight knit with the police. And the reason that the police officer I spoke to knows so much about this is because of collective memory. Like, it's a known thing. And in that video, the person they interviewed was, one of the people they interviewed was this guy, Joe Robinson. His dad was Andy Robinson. He was like he was a police chief for 3 terms of Boise. And he went into the tunnels underground. The head of the Chinese Masonic Society was like head of all the Tongs. The Tongs are like associations of groups. There's so much to this. But so in the video, the guy's like, the head Chinaman took my dad and I down there and showed us the tunnels. And the first voice in that little clip I played you guys, that guy knew him, like the guy in the video who's like really old. And so then he was explaining how, like, as a police chief, like, the guy took him down into the tunnels, and he said he was 14 when that happened. And so I looked at that guy's death record, and turns out he would have been 14 in 1911, which is the same year that his dad became the police chief for the first time. And so, anyway, there's like a lot of things like that where it corresponds to the police. Like, I talked to another guy who's Shellworth was like, I think the first police chief. And his like grandson was like, yeah, my grandfather told me about the tunnels. And so I think there was like some deal with the Chinese where it was like smuggling opium. And again, they were forced to do that. Like, not like, do it now, but like they were making nothing here. I mean, still so much, they were horribly impoverished in China, but they were, opium curbs hunger pains, one, and pains, and like they would work 15 hours a day. But Boise, one of the things is we were caught in the middle. We almost had the Tong Wars, which Tong eventually came to mean gang in America, which is why we changed it to association. And so Edmund Fong's dad was the leader of the Hip Sing Tong. So the biggest Chinatowns were in like New York and San Francisco, and Boise is right in the middle of that. So they would come battle in Boise. And that's the other reason people think that the tunnels were used, is because the Boise didn't really want to get involved. They're like, you guys are beefing, that's cool, you do you, not really feeling it though. So like, they think that these tunnels were built or really utilized because Boise's Tong and like population, Chinese population, was like scared to death of getting, because they just like come up, the Chinese on Chinese violence was incredibly prevalent. Like, that's true, and so Edmund Fong said like he remembers being a kid, he was born in the 30s, and they had like, boarded up, their doors were boarded up because they were afraid like someone was going to come in and murder them, because hatchet men from these places, which were like the Chinese vigilante police. So they'll, they would come, and then the people in Boise sort of like hid underground in order to protect that. I don't know. Sorry, that was a long answer. But any other questions or?
Yeah, I have one. So first, I just wanted to make a comment and say that I like how you interviewed people who didn't believe in the tunnels, but also believed in the tunnels. I think that was, like you said, a very holistic, like well-rounded way to go about your interviewing process. But then one question I have is, I think on the slide where you talk about the project and the contents of it, you mentioned a history of looking further back than the tunnels. What did you mean by that, and what would you look at? What would you suggest looking at?
So the history beyond the tunnels is kind of like, it comes back to this idea of why, because everyone's like, why would we have these tunnels? And the reason people ask why is there's this bubble where they don't really understand how brutal we were towards them. And so if they didn't want to get, like, people would just throw rocks at them, like stone them on the street. You don't get in trouble for that. And so, if you didn't want to be like harassed on the street, you went underground. And so in order to explain the myth of the tunnels or the legend, whatever, I felt like I had to explain the history, because there were things like the Hell's Canyon massacre. We didn't even acknowledge that until 2005. That's kind of like how suppressed this history is. So I wanted to kind of like unearth it and uncover it and be like, actually, like, this is a big deal, and this is what led to the tunnels. It's like, kind of like with the critical lens, it's like you dig deeper and you're like, okay, let's go back a little further and then see what's up. So.
Okay. So I think I just misunderstood what the purpose of that was. So you said that you went back and looked at the history, not that that's like what needs to be done.
Yeah. Like, well, I think it needs to be done, that people need to understand this history. Like, one of the guys I talked to, it was painful. He was, sorry, he was just like, the Chinese, it wasn't that bad for them. Like, where would you even need to go? And, it wasn't that big a deal. And like, he was like, well, most minorities were persecuted like way more than the Chinese, like Black people. I'm like, we don't have any Black people like in Boise. And we had an anti-Chinese parade or ceremony or whatever the group, like the KKK thing, branch of the anti-Chinese in Boise. Like, this was a thing, and he's like, well, it wasn't really that bad. I'm just like, oh my God. So that is like one of those things where it's like, man, you gotta know the history. Otherwise you don't understand the reason for these tunnels. So.
Okay. Another question is, you kind of touched on it, but I just wanted to get some clarity, was like, how were the tunnels created, and were the Chinese people like pushed into them, or did they decide to use them as like a place to hide?
Yeah, so the tunnels, like, there's multiple theories, right? But most of these people were miners who, like, after the gold rush, they were like, okay, what are we gonna do? We're like, we want to be merchants. We can make more money here than somewhere else. So they came to Boise, and so they'd have the ability to like tunnel. And again, like, Boise's, it wasn't always paved street, which a lot of people forget. We used to have wooden pavement, actually, which was like total nightmare. But so it would have been possible to do that. And then there's also a creek or a canal-ish, I don't know the nuances of that term, but that goes right under the city, and it goes right where Hannafin's cigar shop was, which is like known to have a tunnel. They thought it was for bootlegging. That's where the canal leads. And then right to the Egyptian, it turns, which is also where, and I've seen those tunnels too. I got to, like, a girl snuck me down there and I got to see them. And so it was more of people utilizing things. That was the thing. It wasn't like they were like digging like constantly. They were very industrious and resourceful. So they were able to like find ways to get around. They use these tunnels. I talked to one guy whose dad was born in like 1890, and he said, oh yeah, like the canal underneath, at the time, if you just put, stepping stones on there, you'd walk, it was like a hallway, they didn't have to do anything. And the other part of the tunnels is like knocked through walls. So like a lot of like, I know some bars, I don't know if they've covered it up or like sealed them up, but you just knock through the wall. And I talked to an architect who said like the way these buildings were built, if you knocked through that sidewall, because it was like the weight was on these 2 poles or whatever, rather than like this whole thing, it was just like the wall was filler, you could just knock through there. And because the Chinese in like downtown in like a 4-block area, like Idaho Street to like, like 6th to 8th area, there were 1,300 Chinese people packed in that place at one point. So all these Chinese businesses were really close together. So you just like knock through and then you don't have to go out on the street. So that's sort of the thing, right? Like the Superior Wharf linguistics is like, what is a tunnel? Because then if we misunderstand, they're like, well, that wasn't really a tunnel. We're like, okay, cool. But that doesn't change the point that like, so was that your whole question?
So were the tunnels made by the Chinese people, or were they already pre-made and the Chinese people just took advantage and used them?
Yeah, so it's more like the latter, like the creeks and stuff.
And then the last part of my original question was, did the Chinese people decide to use them, or were they pushed into them?
No, they decided to use them, like because it was advantageous of them. It's not like, Boiseans were like, get down under there. But, in the evenings, they're like, get in your house. So by effect, they were, but yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I had one for you, Mallory. First of all, my sincerest apologies for showing up late. That was extremely rude of me and unprofessional. So I'm sorry in advance if this is a little like reiteration, but how obscure are these tunnels to like people occupying Boise in general, if that makes any sense, if it is obscure at all?
What was it? How obscure is what?
How obscure are the tunnels to like people occupying Boise, if it is obscure at all? Like, is it well known to the people of Boise, would you say?
Well, the people of Boise born before the 70s have heard of the tunnels. Like everyone I talked to is like, well, you weren't here for the first part, but they're just like, these were a thing. Like everyone knew about the tunnels. I mean, obviously after their main usage era, not when they were using them, they knew about the tunnels. But, and that is actually a really interesting point, because people born after the 70s are all the ones who were like, that's not real. And I'm like, okay, like you don't really know. And so it's hard to tell and I haven't told anyone, but it's hard to be like, you don't, like, from your perspective, like you don't see the whole picture. Like, so the mayor of Chinatown's son told me directly, like personally, me, Molly, which is so cool. It was like such an honor to speak to him. Like, yeah, these tunnels are real. And my dad told me about them. So it's kind of like, why don't people believe in this? But I mean, I don't know if you guys had ever heard that there was a Chinese population in Boise at any time. Most people think that Garden City was the first Chinatown. That was like their third one. They were segregated to Idaho Street. And then the city was like, actually, we want to use that place. You can move to Front Street. So we moved them there. And then they're like, actually, like, you guys can go ahead and go to Garden City. And that's why, like, kind of why Garden City was always considered like the low part of town because of that. So Chinden Boulevard is Chinese Garden. It's whatever the shortened term there is. But, and those people, I mean, it was terrible. They would be stoned, shot at, everything like that. This is in the 20s, So, and one of the tunnels actually does run to the river. So some people who know about it, who are younger, know of it from that because it was from their laundries. Oh, that's the other thing I didn't mention, Kara, when you asked, is most of the locations correspond to the laundries because that was one of their biggest businesses. So they had to have their water flow out somewhere. So that's why there's a tunnel that runs the river, but they utilized these tunnels. So if that helps.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I for one didn't know about the project that you're doing. I was really interested in it. I just knew of like the Basque culture here.
Yeah, that's one of the Basque people were able to be so successful actually because they were able to move in to where the Chinese people were kicked out of. So when the Chinese people were kicked out, the Basque people, and like, that's great. Like, I love Basque culture. I've learned all about them growing up in Boise. But like the Basque people came here and they're like, are these a bunch of houses just like up for grabs here? But people used to call actually the Basque part of town Midget Village because, and this is like in the 70s and 80s, people are talking about like growing up, that was Midget Village, you know, because they were like short or whatever. That's like how common this is. And we just don't even see it, you know, because we're not exposed to it. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, a large part of their history here is their parades and stuff. And everyone's like sees the Chinese contribution of like, they have these really cool New Year's parades, but every other day of the year we were like, get out, we hate you. So I'm like, I feel like you say that first part and you forget the second part. Anyways, I'm super passionate about it. So, but I know my time's up, so I don't want to take your guys' time.
Yeah. No, actually, I just have one last question. It was a really interesting topic, and I look forward to looking at your work. Because I've been waiting all semester to kind of see the end result, because we've been talking about it in our meetings and everything. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in detail. And I remember first hearing about the Chinese internment camps in college. And that was the first time I was like, we had what here? Like what? So yeah. I found that whole idea really interesting to think about. But I think it's pretty typical that there's so many things in history that have been whitewashed. So it's just interesting to look at the specific element that's close to home. But my question is, what's next for you with this project? Because I mean, it's obviously such a passion project that's not stopping.
Yeah, well, I want to redo the podcast because after I lost that, it was devastating. I mean, I've been researching these since March, and I've been working on the podcast since like a month after class started. And then I was just like, okay, I don't know if that was a law of attraction thing, but so redo that. And I want to incorporate the other interviews I've had. And, you know, if I had time, like really dive into, because, you know, I've looked at maps from 1884, you know, that's the oldest map of the city you can find. Mm-hmm. Rooting all that, I'd love to find out where they were and find out more about the history. And everyone says, like, who I speak to is like, you should get a grant for this. So depending on how the job search turns out, it'll be like that. But it's something that I want to continue. And I think it's interesting. I mean, like, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I had to track down, like, on Reddit, they're like, if you want to know about the tunnel, speak to the tarot reader at 10th Street Station. But that comment was posted 2 years ago. So... and I finally tracked the guy down, but it was just like, this is so much harder than you would imagine.
Found it.
So, yeah.
Well, it's a good job. It was really
Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. I really appreciate it and listening to me ramble about them.
All right. Good luck.
Good job.
Thanks.